Hello, this is the Wisconsin Legislative Oral History Project. I'm John Powell, and our guest on this, the second edition of the Oral History Project, is now Professor of Governmental Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Mordecai Lee, who served in the State Assembly from 1977 through 82, and then in the State Senate from 1983 through 89. Thanks very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to getting your take on what happened then and what's happening now.
You know, John, I was a little insulted when I got the invitation because I'm only 60 years old. I'm not some ancient doddering guy. Please, don't make me that old.
Well, but you're the expert, Professor of Governmental Affairs. Are you planning on running again, by the way? Is that an announcement? Is that why we can't do you? Apparently not. How did you get involved in politics? You're a native of Milwaukee.
Right, I'm a third-generation Milwaukeean, and for reasons that I can't even explain, when I was a teenager, I loved reading the newspaper, I loved watching the news, and I thought it seemed so interesting to be involved in doing things to make society, make the world a better place. And I was an undergraduate at Madison. I graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1970, right after all the demonstrations. And I sort of wanted to get involved in public affairs, but wasn't quite sure how to do it. And a professor of mine suggested I get degrees in public administration, a field I'd never heard of. So I went to Syracuse University, which had a high-quality school in public administration, and got a master's and then a PhD, but didn't want to be a professor. And eventually I got hired by Congressman Henry Royce, who was the congressman from Milwaukee at the time, to be his legislative assistant in Washington. He had just become the chairman of the House Banking Committee. This would be like 1975. And it was just a real honor to be a kid, you know, to go to Washington and be a legislative assistant to a senior congressman. And it was just thrilling because it was sort of what I was wanting to do. I was getting involved in public affairs. And then one day, my mom called me from Milwaukee and said, I want to let you know that the state assemblyman from our neighborhood, from the Sherman Park neighborhood, Paul Sekula, has announced he's not running for re-election. And she said, you know, you've always talked about being interested in politics, and if you want to do it, it's now or never. And I sort of resigned from Henry's office, put all my stuff in the back of my car, drove to Milwaukee, and started running for the state assembly. And I was a total newcomer. I'd never been in politics before. But I had this bug. I wanted to be involved in important things. And to everybody's surprise, including mine, I won the election.
Well, how do you win an election? What did you do when you got back to Milwaukee?
Well, you know, state assembly districts are relatively small. It's the perfect entry-level job for people like me who are interested in a career in politics. It's only about 55, 60,000 people. And a lot of districts are one-party districts. In other words, you win the Republican Party, you're in. You win the Democratic primary, you're in. City of Milwaukee, largely Democratic, and so what it meant was winning the Democratic primary. So now we're talking about a relatively small population of people who vote in primaries. And I was able to put together a list of what we called hardcore voters. In other words, you don't go to every house. You don't even go to every house of a registered voter. You go to people who in the past voted in low turnout elections. So I door-to-doored the district about 2.5 times. It was like a full-time job. You get up in the morning, you put your tie on, and you start ringing doorbells. And I think it was that personal contact. You know, they like the voters like the idea they can look a person in the eye, they can size him or her up, they can shake their hands, they can ask them any question they want. And for me, that campaign was really a transformative experience. You know, I had led a relatively standard middle-class life. I was a baby boomer. And in that neighborhood, there was such a heterogeneity of populations. There were whites and African Americans. There were middle-class people and there were poor people. And so, really, for the first time in my life, I stepped out of my bubble and I saw the reality of life, people struggling to make a living, people wanting to be good citizens. So I really have to say that the campaign was an important part of what I became as a politician.
Did you have a primary election then?
Yeah, I had a primary.
How many opponents?
There were 2 other opponents, so it was a 3-way race. One opponent was a lawyer who was endorsed by Paul Sekula, by the outgoing incumbent, you know, a highly coveted endorsement. The other one was a neighborhood activist, a woman. And, you know, I was sort of the guy who, you know, was the newcomer. And I'm not quite even sure why I won the primary. I mean, it has to be that I left a good impression at the doors and the fact that I came back more than once. But I did win the primary, and that was the beginning of a career in the legislature.
Did you spend any money?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that because the state assembly is such an entry-level job, it doesn't involve the kinds of huge numbers that nowadays we talk about in terms of politics. It doesn't involve millions of dollars. It doesn't even involve hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, I was a bachelor. I had some savings, so I put in a couple thousand of my own money, and I hit up my mom, and I hit up my dad, and hit up my sisters. And I think that campaign cost probably about $7,000 or $8,000. And so it was doable without having to beg for money from strangers. I've got to tell you, the worst aspect of politics, in my opinion, is fundraising. And so I was really lucky that an assembly district is so small that I really didn't have to dial for dollars.
What did you spend the money on? Pamphlets?
Yeah, I spent the money on pamphlets. I spent the money on follow-up letters. I spent them on a couple of lit drops that we did on the couple of weekends before the primary. So it was very targeted kind of work, but really expensive.
Now, in a relatively large market like Milwaukee, advertising prices on TV and the daily newspapers are very high, so that wasn't even a consideration at the time?
Exactly, and that's really the difference between urban politics and sort of country politics, because there are probably 25 assembly districts in the Milwaukee TV market, or 25 assembly districts in the newspaper market. And you don't want to spend all that money to get 4 cents worth of exposure. But when you go into rural areas, like let's say the Rhinelander TV market, now it's starting to get more reasonable because low-density counties, you might have an assembly district that's practically encompasses that media market. That's when television advertising for a small race might make sense.
And a very different job of campaigning when you have a huge geographical area. You could walk door to door.
Yeah, you know, that was what was amazing. I mean, I'd get out of my flat and I'd drive 5 minutes, and I was on the other side of the assembly district. Whereas if you talk to some of the state reps from northern Wisconsin, you know, they get out of their house and they drive 2 hours and they finally make it to the other side of their assembly district. It's amazing how different it is.
Now, what kind of reaction did you get from people? Did you say you got a wide cross-section of your district? Typically going to a door, what happened?
Typically, the first thing that would happen is they wanted to know if I was a door-to-door salesman or if I was a religious proselytizer. And so after only about a week of going door to door, I realized I needed a nameplate. And it would say, you know, Mordecai Lee, Democratic candidate for the state assembly. And so that overcame the first barrier because people were sort of reluctant. They didn't want to get involved. What was interesting is that as soon as they realized that I was running for office and wanted to introduce myself, 99% of the people were friendly. 99% of the people, it sort of triggered their citizenship sense of belonging. Oh, this guy's running, I'm going to have to vote in his election. I want to get a sense of him. But what really came through is occasionally people would ask me about issues. What's your stand on this? What's your stand on that? But mostly it seemed to me and their reactions were, they wanted to know what my qualifications were. And so what I would emphasize was that I had 2 degrees in public administration and government, and that I'd worked for a congressman, and that I thought that qualified me to write laws. And then sometimes I'd throw in a quip at the end and I'd say, and so you see I'm not a lawyer, but I hope you won't hold that against me. Because one of my opponents, the guy who was endorsed by Paul Sekula, was a lawyer. And every time I'd say, and I'm not a lawyer, I hope you won't hold that against me, people would tell me their lawyer stories. It was amazing. I had a summer's worth of lawyer stories. And I think maybe one of the reasons I won the election is they say, I want to vote for that guy with the weird name who's not a lawyer. I mean, it's sort of, that's how they came to see me.
And did you emphasize that you're a native of the district?
Yeah, I would always emphasize that I was a 3rd-generation Milwaukeean, that both of my parents had gone to Washington High School, which is in that neighborhood. So people understood that I had roots there. And in fact, occasionally what would happen is people would say, is your dad Jack Lee? And I'd say, yeah. And they'd say, I remember him in the senior class play. And he was such a great actor, you know. And so I spent a summer hearing stories about my parents and my grandparents. It was really a wonderful experience.
We want to move on to the rest of your career, but I think I should regress just a moment and ask you about Henry Royce and working in the congressman's office and at that period in time, and about Henry Royce himself.
Henry Royce was the brightest person I ever met. And having gone through a university PhD program and now working in a university, I've met lots of bright people. I never understood why he had staff, because he was so bright that he could just eat up a position paper. And in fact, his favorite activity, not only was he bright, but for a politician, he was pretty shy. I mean, he wasn't gregarious, he wasn't a backslapper. His idea of a great day was to sit in his office all alone, without the phone ringing, reading position papers and dictating speeches about arcane monetary policy. And so, at first I wondered, what the heck am I doing here? But then eventually he gave me some assignments that I had to do both with legislation and with keeping an eye on the district. He had just become chairman of the House Banking Committee. He was very much involved in that. And so I was sort of like the guy who made sure that Henry was aware of what was going on in the district and that he was involved in those things.
Now, he was known as the expert on, as you say, arcane financial things and the workings of banks, and he was the banking expert, really, in Congress. That seems awfully dry, but it's also important, isn't it?
It's amazing. There are some politicians who are motivated by different things, motivated by a desire for personal success, or motivated by wanting to be parochial for their district. I want to get a bridge for my district. And here you had really the exception to the rule. I'm glad you pointed that out, John, because politically there's no percentage in talking about the Italian exchange rate, or if the sterling is overvalued. He didn't get a single vote back home by that, but he was interested in policy and he was stable in his district. He was a great politician in terms of dealing with his constituents. And so he had the luxury of focusing on public policy that did not have a political payoff.
Do you consider yourself an extrovert?
Wow.
So many politicians are. I mean, it's an obvious help if you're going out and schmoozing and backslapping.
You know what? That's a great question. And to let my defenses down for a second, I actually consider myself a pretty introverted guy. And so being in politics took a bit of an effort. You just sort of put on your public face and you become gregarious. But I'll confess I was a little bit like Henry when I was in the legislature. I didn't pal around with people, and I didn't go out to dinner and drinks with people. And so I guess I was one of those few politicians who was introverted, but was able to overcome that enough to deal with people.
So talk about your first terms in the State Assembly then, starting in 1977. What was the Assembly like?
It was a zoo. I have to tell you, I came in this idealistic guy who, in 1976 is right after Watergate. Everybody wanted to clean up government. Everybody wanted reforms, government reforms. And I remember those first couple of floor sessions. I would sit in this beautiful chambers, these incredibly impressive chambers, and look at my colleagues, and I'd think, God save the Republic. Because some of them there really didn't care about public policy, were there for reasons that were other than sort of improving government. And the Assembly is this really sort of anarchic institution, 99 people all trying to get to the top of the greasy pole. It had a culture of a kind of a fraternity party. Yes, there were women representatives, but it was overwhelmingly male. It had the atmosphere of when we think of the stereotype of a guy going to a convention. He leaves his wife behind, he leaves all his inhibitions behind, and he spends a week getting drunk and cheating on his wife. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, in 1977, that was what the State Assembly was like. And there was hazing of the freshmen, and there was meanness, and there was no collegiality, and it was a rough and tumble place. And I have to admit, I didn't enjoy it, and I don't think I did very well.
How did they haze the freshmen?
Well, I can tell you how I was hazed. When State Assemblyman has a visitor citizen sitting in the galleries, the citizens fill out a slip, and then a messenger, takes it from them, goes onto the floor of the chambers, and hands it to the representative. And then the representative stands up and says, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to interrupt the business simply to note the presence of my constituents, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. So they gave me one that when you read it out loud, it said something vulgar. But the way it was spelled out, I didn't see it. And so they hazed me pretty good, and I was embarrassed and humiliated, and these guys were just absolutely delighted.
Well, now, drinking and womanizing, and that was commonplace? I won't ask you to name names, but this was common?
This was a real party atmosphere, and it was a very intense atmosphere. So it was sort of hard-working and hard-playing. The hard-working aspect of it was that there was a lot of meanness, not only in terms of hazing the freshmen, but a lot of intensity of rivalries between factions. Of course, you had the partisan rivalry between the majority party. The Democratic Party in those days was the majority party in the Assembly, and the minority party. So there was very intense factionalism there. But within the Democratic majority, there were two factions. There were essentially the liberals and the Democratic conservatives. And they were just at each other's throats. They disdained each other. They couldn't stand being in the same room with each other. They tried to undercut each other. And so that's really contributed to the unpleasant atmosphere of the House.
So at the time, the Democrats had a big majority.
We had
but that doesn't guarantee smooth sailing, obviously.
That's the perfect way to put it, John. We had a numeric majority in terms of partisan numbers. But the size of the conservative wing of the Democratic Party was large enough that if you put the conservatives and the Republicans together, they were a numeric majority. They were the conservative coalition. And so for the majority party to rule, there constantly needed to be this sort of wheeling and dealing to keep the conservatives to vote for them, because otherwise they would routinely follow the minority leader. And there was this sort of rivalry for power in terms of if the liberals of the Democratic majority were in control, the conservatives would try to topple them, would try to undermine them at every possible opportunity.
Now, in some ways, the legislature has always been socially conservative. I'm thinking of abortion, for instance. Many Democrats are anti-abortion, still are. It seems that the legislature has always been substantially anti-abortion, in spite of the fact that the Democrats may advertise themselves as liberals when it comes to social issues. Is that a fair analysis?
I think that's a fair analysis, because generally speaking, if you have a poll and you ask people about abortion, generally speaking, a small majority of Americans, 55, 60%, are in favor of abortions under certain circumstances. But you're right, John, that a numeric majority in the state assembly in those days was pro-life, not pro-choice. And it sort of always surprised me. But sometimes it was people, regardless of their district, they felt that way due to their ethics, their morality, their religion. Sometimes people did it because they felt that the political power back in their district, the activists, the ones who were following their votes, were more pro-life than pro-choice. There's a lot. Now, abortion is an unusual issue because it's such an emotional issue, and every single American has a position on it. But generally speaking, the atmosphere in the assembly, when people decided, am I on this side of something or on that side of something, to my appalled reaction, it was like people were weighing their mail. Well, I got 4 letters in favor of AB 38, and I got 3 letters against AB 38, and so that means my district is for AB 38. Now, that's not how it would happen on abortion, but there was a lot of that going on, that they were taking positions as though they were somehow neutral judges listening to the evidence from their district.
So letters to your representative, or now I suppose emails, they really are effective. They look at them. I
was astounded. You could get one really good letter, and that would affect your thinking. And people would, let's say, quote that letter on the floor, put that letter in their bill file and go back to it later. Generally, the rule of thumb, whether we're not talking about email or whether in those days before email was created, the rule of thumb for a politician is that the weight of a communication is based on how much the constituent invested in the communication. So, for example, signing a petition, that takes 3 seconds. Sending an email, that takes 30 seconds. Writing a letter, not a form letter, writing a letter in longhand, telling a personal story, addressing it, mailing it, that's an hour's worth of time. Those were the letters that had huge impact.
So we sometimes read about the phony campaigns, the AstroTurf rather than grassroots, which are instigated by an organization sending out forms, and then the member of Congress or somebody is inundated with form letters. They pretty much ignore those.
What really surprised me when I became an assemblyman, my first rule was that I wanted to hear from my constituents. If they left me a phone message, if they sent me a letter, if they called me, whatever it was, if they were constituents, they got first-class service. I would get back to them as fast as I could. But balancing that out, I had a rule that I didn't care about letters that came from non-constituents, and I certainly didn't want to talk to lobbyists who were really unrelated to issues of my district. To my surprise, not every member of the assembly in those days had the same standard. They would read letters from non-constituents, they would react to letters from non-constituents, they would have an open door to any lobbyist on any issue. So it really came down to a legislator's self-definition of, this is the public that I'm listening to, and I'm going to define what that public is.
When you told lobbyists they weren't welcome, that was unusual, wasn't it? What was the reaction?
You know, I thought that would be what everybody did. And it turned out that a week after I won my first election, I started getting letters from professional associations. You know, the Wholesale Liquor Association and the Policemen's Benevolent Association. From their lobbyist, the Madison letterhead saying, "Dear Mr. Lee, congratulations on your election to the State Assembly. I'm looking forward to working with you." And I would read that sentence, "You're looking forward to working with me? You're a lobbyist. I'm going to be a member of this." And I didn't realize that the culture in those days practically elevated lobbyists to open access and valued expertise on anything. And so the vast majority of state assemblymen and women in those days, if any lobbyist would turn up at their door, say to their secretary, "I'm the lobbyist for the, you know, dam owners of Wisconsin, hydroelectric owners of Wisconsin, may I have a moment to talk to Representative so-and-so?" In 5 seconds, they'd be ushered in. Whereas I told my secretary, ask them if there's anybody from my district, you know, who's involved with them, and if so, I'd like to hear from that constituent, and turn them away. And I got this sort of weird reputation of being sort of holier than thou and sort of self-righteous, and I just thought that I was doing the job that I was elected to. And, you know, in those days, not only were lobbyists working with you, I look forward to working with you, but in those days, the ethics code was much weaker, and almost every evening there was a reception by special interest groups.
A fundraiser.
A fundraiser, a legislative reception, a Madison Day, and the vast majority of assemblymen would go to it, and that would be their dinner. You know, they would get free money, free food, I misspoke, because this is before the rule about anything of value. And so it was a way of life that after a floor session was over, everybody would troop over to a reception held by a special interest group and get free drinks and free food. And in fact, I was so appalled, sometimes they would time the adjournment so that they wouldn't miss the reception. You know, and like the majority leader would say, "Well, we've still got 3 bills we got to deal with," and the backbenchers would say, no, let's adjourn, it's 5:30, let's adjourn. And that almost drove legislative life. And so I guess from your questions, John, I am depicting myself as a real outsider. I didn't like the culture of the assembly, and I tried to live up to my own ethics, but I really was an outlier.
And the rule was also you didn't come back after dinner, right?
Absolutely.
Because some members would be...
they would be smashed. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. And occasionally, when we absolutely had to have post-dinner sessions, that would happen. And it would be so embarrassing when one of those assemblymen would stand up and be slurring his words. But it was somehow accepted, or it was overlooked. And so, again, from your question, John, you're really taking us to a time and place that's so different from now when we're taping this interview.
Yeah, what has changed from what you know of how things work today?
Well, we have to focus on the fact that the Assembly and Senate back then were different, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that. But I think the big changes between the 1970s and now is, first of all, the rule that a state legislator can take nothing of value. So that totally eliminated all the freebies from lobbyists, the free dinners from lobbyists, the special interest receptions, the free liquor. You know, that was a wonderful rule. And the other big change is really the technology of instant communication. When you're sitting on the floor of the session today and you just cast a vote on an amendment, and up pops your email, and it's from a constituent who's watching it on Wisconsin Eye, and who cares about this subject, some arcane subject, chiropractor regulation, and sends you an email and says, why did you vote against Amendment 33? I'm for Amendment 33. So it's the instant communication that I think makes politicians nowadays much more timid. And the other thing that's so different today is that campaigns, even for the state assembly, for these small entry-level districts, have gotten so expensive that I think you find legislators who are really sort of trimming their sails by thinking, if I cast this vote this way, then a special interest group will be mad at me and I won't get the $500 from their PAC. And now that's not selling a vote, that's not illegal, but I'm afraid that sometimes the desire to raise enough money to get reelected becomes important to legislators of current times.
We should explain that for several years now, members of the Assembly have had laptops that they've been given by the legislature so that they can sit right there on the floor and look up websites for information, or, as you say, get mail from their constituents right there during debate.
And to show you how ancient...
Is that a good thing?
I'm not sure, but to show you how ancient I am, I was joking at the beginning that I'm only 60, I'm not that ancient. I mean, when I was in the legislature, we had rotary telephones. There were just beginning to come in telephone answering machines. There were no faxes, there were no cell phones, there were no laptops, there were no PCs. I mean, it truly was a different world. And so hearing from constituents, I remember sometimes they would leave a message on my answering machine at home. I got a lot of hang-ups on my answering machine because people were intimidated by it, they weren't used to it. But for those who would leave a message, I'd call long distance from my Capitol office, I'd get the message, I'd call them back and I'd say, I'm calling long distance from Madison, I just got your message. And it was sort of like an event, because in those days a long distance phone call was a big deal. Now, of course, we have free nationwide calling. And it was sort of fun to do because the constituent felt a sense of recognition. I was calling them from Madison, I wanted to hear their views. But you're right, John, it was truly a different place and time.
And contrast it with, well, first I want to go back. You were talking about people balancing their mail, if they get one more letter on one side than the other. The basic question always has been, is it the duty of a representative to represent or lead?
I think that's a great question, and that's an eternal question, for which there will really never be one correct answer. And I think it's a kind of an operational sense on the part of each individual legislator. Am I representing my district, or am I representing principles that I believe in? And then if they defeat me for re-election, I would have stood by my principles. I think that for the legislators who didn't care about public policy, and I was astounded that there were legislators in the legislature who were there for reasons other than public policy.
For their own ambition, or? For
their own ambition to get off an assembly line, to use a blue-collar example, to get away from home, to use a family example. But they really didn't care about the substance of passing legislation. Most of the life in the legislature is eye-glazingly boring. John, you poor guy, you sat through 20 years of those debates and you maintained your sanity.
And all the hearings.
Exactly. So for those who weren't interested in public policy, I think, John, your question really is accurate, that they view themselves as parochial representatives of their district. And the other thing related to that is they view themselves as passive representatives of their district. And that's when it came to weighing letters. It wasn't so much that, well, I represent a blue-collar neighborhood and I might not have gotten a lot of letters on this issue that relates to blue-collar issues, but I know for sure that, for blue-collar people I ought to vote X. There was one category of legislators who were very passive about it. They weren't advocates. They were sort of like judges in black robes. Well, I'll weigh the evidence, the letters I got, and then I'll cast my vote. For the legislators who were interested in public policy, I think now we're getting into the much harder issue of, was he or she representing his district, or he or she leading on principles? And I'll tell you in my own case that I rationalized to myself that for most issues I was representing my neighborhood, but in an activist way. Whether or not my letters reflected it, if I felt something was in the best interest of my neighborhood, I cast my vote that way, and come hell or high water. And there are other times where I knew that I was voting against public opinion. In fact, there was one vote that I cast that if the culture of recall had existed back in the 70s, You know, recall was legal back then, but it had been totally forgotten about. I think from that vote, if the culture of recall had existed, I would have been recalled based on that one vote. It had to do with increasing the drinking age, which at the time was 18. You know, as a result of the Vietnam War in the 1960s, it was the argument about old enough to die for your country, old enough to drink.
And old enough to vote with the amendment.
Absolutely.
We were not old enough to vote till we were 21,
exactly.
Or at least I wasn't. Maybe you got in.
No. I was like you. The first election when I cast a vote, I was over 21. And so I'm, you know, in my mid-20s, I'm in the state legislature, and they're talking about all these teenagers, all these irresponsible teenagers. They're causing death and mayhem on the roads. Let's increase the drinking age. And I'm not sure the statistics were there, but public opinion tilted, skewed old. You know, the people who were over 21, and then the elderly voters, yeah, they wanted, those rough guys, you know, they wanted to increase the drinking age. And there was virtually no constituency against increasing the drinking age. You know, maybe a few bars and maybe a few teenagers, but that was about it. So I knew that public opinion in my district wanted to increase the drinking age, and I voted against increasing it. And to my bad luck, the Milwaukee Journal decided it was such an important roll call, they were going to put it on the front page of the paper. And I got to tell you, I felt like I was really hanging out there, in the sense, you know, so there's Assembly, Democrats voting in favor, you know.
Most of them.
Voting against Lee. You know, Republicans voting for, most of them. Voting against, I think it was 0. And I felt pretty naked. And I know that people weren't happy with me, and I got my share of phone calls. And, you know, what I said was, you know, I'm sorry we disagree, but that I hope by the time I'm running for re-election that you'll be able to review my entire record, and that you'll find yourself much more in agreement with the votes I cast than disagreement. Because that's what a general election is about. And the reason I think I would have been recalled is that recall elections are not about a person's total record. They're about one issue. And so that's an example of where I was willing to put my own ethics on the line and come what may.
Obviously, it did not keep you from getting re-elected.
It did not keep me, because, you know, by a year later, there had been a zillion more issues, and who remembered the issue of the drinking age?
There's only been one legislator successfully recalled in history, even though it's been on the books for more than 100 years, I think, George Petak in
right.
Racine over the vote for the Milwaukee Brewers Stadium. Only one that it's actually been recalled. And yet, I remember from floor debate, lots of times people would be talking as if their vote on an amendment at 2 in the morning would decide their political future. Is that kind of paranoid?
I think politicians are professional paranoids. I mean, I really liked the word you used. And especially if we go back to the legislator who's very timid, who wants to get reelected, doesn't care about public policy, wants his or her district to like them. For those legislators, the kind of comment that you just mentioned, that's absolutely true. They were afraid of their own shadow. And so sometimes you had majority party Democrats who would vote with the Republicans just to be on what they considered a safe side. And that's true, that a lot of politicians did not want to spend political capital on anything. You know, they just wanted to put political capital in the bank. They just wanted to get reelected. And now the culture of recall, I think, validates those speeches that you remember, John. It's true that you just never know. That one roll call at 2 in the morning, if some special interest group is going to capitalize on it, and you're going to be out of office 90 days later.
You've talked about a couple of the big issues during the 1970s in the legislature. The drinking age was one, abortion the perennial. There are other issues that stand out that were important in that era?
Well, believe it or not, civil service reform had a little bit of cachet. And I was involved in that because I had a doctorate in public administration. I cared about it, but it was not that popular a bill. Ethics reform was very, very big because this was in the post-Watergate era. And what really surprised me is how hard it was to pass government reform legislation. You know, whether we were talking about strengthening the ethics code, whether we were talking about more regulation of elections laws, whether we were talking about the open meetings laws or the open records laws, those were always very, very controversial, and controversial for the wrong reason, in the sense that legislators did not want to be hampered or constrained by those laws. So, for example, the classic example is when they finally got around to prohibiting robocalls. They exempted themselves.
Explain robocalls.
Oh, robocalls is when you have a machine calling numbers and then
during a campaign.
During a campaign
thing.
And a lot of mass retailers use it. You know, it's a standard kind of mass marketing technique of junk phone calls. But when the legislature a few years later finally got around to prohibiting that, they exempted themselves from it. And so in my years in the 1970s, whenever we had an ethics code strengthening, whenever we had election law strengthening, the legislators, to my surprise, were very open. Instead of saying, yeah, we need good government, you know, I don't care if it affects me, they were just the opposite. No, this would affect me. I don't like this. I'm going to vote against it. I'm putting in an amendment to delete this from the bill. And so the late 1970s were very much an uphill battle to get a decent code of ethics and good government legislation through.
And you were talking about infighting. In the late 70s, I believe it was the late 70s, the speaker was, in fact, ousted. Lost his bid to become the speaker again. And
well, the most famous event that I remember was with Speaker Giacomonis, and that was in the late 70s. He was a Democrat of the majority party. He was from the liberal wing of the majority party. And what would happen at the beginning of every legislative session, as the majority party, there'd be a race for speaker, and there'd generally come down to one liberal versus one conservative. And generally speaking, the liberal would win. And so the moment of truth, the moment of power would be, who would this new speaker give all the plum appointments to? Who would get on the Joint Finance Committee? Who would get to be chairman of this and chairman of that? And the conservatives played this, what I thought, strange game, and that was they were vociferously trying to defeat the liberal speaker. And then if the liberal speaker dared take away any of their committee positions, they would cry foul. You know, it would sort of be like Claude Rains in Casablanca, that they were shocked that they were being denied continuing to serve as chairman of this or chairman of that. And it got so bad, at one point, Speaker Giacomonis indeed started stripping people of chairmanships. I was the beneficiary of it. I was named chairman of the Local Affairs Committee, which meant that I automatically served on the board of directors of what's now called WEDA, the Wisconsin Housing and Economic Development Agency. And the previous chair, who was a conservative and who coveted that seat on the WEDA board, and the other conservatives conspired with the Republicans that they were going to topple Giacomonis. They were going to elect a conservative Democratic speaker with Republican votes. And it was going from bad to worse, and we were coming to a showdown, and finally labor unions intervened, the UAW and the AFL-CIO. And they turned to these conservative Democrats who tended to be sort of Reagan conservatives, you know, sort of blue-collar, pro-union conservatives, and said to them, are you out of your mind? I mean, do you realize what anti-labor legislation would be passed if the governing coalition has a majority of Republicans? And they prevented it at the last minute. It was Bill Trussler from the UAW who personally had intervened. And if it had not been that, then the scenario you just described, John, of actually a speaker being toppled would have occurred.
Now, he was reelected at that point as speaker?
He was retained as speaker.
But then the next time around, he was replaced by the Democrats. Was it the next time? Anyway, he only served 3 terms.
No, he was increasingly unpopular, and so when Tony Earl got elected governor in 1982, Giacomonis asked Earl for an appointment and did not run for re-election. But I think what you're correctly remembering is he was so unpopular that had he run for re-election, he probably would not have been retained as speaker.
Used up his political capital
Absolutely.
over the 3 terms. There's only been one 4-term speaker, Tom Loftus.
Okay.
Somehow he managed to survive 4 terms. Nobody in the previous history or since has managed to be a speaker for more than 3 terms.
You know, it's the old joke about what have you done for me lately? You know, and that's why speakers don't last very long. So, okay, Mr. Speaker, 4 years ago you made me chairman of such and such, but since then you didn't give me a trip to Europe. You know, I'm mad at you. You know, so what have you done for me lately? But what's especially interesting to me about Giacomonis is that Giacomonis was not a very good politician in terms of a backslapper, but he was fabulous at parliamentary procedure. And in those days, the minority leader was John Shabazz, who later went on to be a federal judge in the Madison district. And John Shabazz was a fabulous parliamentarian, and he used parliamentary procedure to bollocks up the legislature. And so when Giacomonis ran, He said, I'm the only guy between you and John Shabazz. I'm the only guy who knows how to outmaneuver John Shabazz when he uses these arcane parliamentary motions. And so Giacomonis had the wrong personality, but he had the right knowledge of parliamentary procedure, which is, in a sense, the main reason that he won that first race for Speaker.
And we should point out that Fred Risser performed the same function in the state Senate many years ago when the Democrats were in the minority in the state Senate. It seems to be the job of the minority leader of either house to tie up the majority party in parliamentary knots. Is that about what it boils down to?
Exactly. And but what's interesting in the change of the times from now in 2009 to then is, in those days it would be the minority leader, like Fred Risser in the Senate or John Shabazz in the Assembly, who did it all, and who did it based on parliamentary procedure, and there wasn't much media coverage of it. It was sort of de rigueur. It was sort of daily life. Now it seems that the minority party, whether it's the Republican Party or Democratic Party, are much more open about, we're against it for any reason, and we're not embarrassed about it. We'll filibuster, we'll vote against every motion, we'll create every hurdle we can, and we're not embarrassed by it. That's what the opposition should do. So the mentality of doing it has really changed.
It's become more aggressive and not sort of finesse through parliamentary procedure, is that? Right,
much more hot-headed, much more anything goes, anything to prevail.
Let's talk about, you became a member of the Senate then in 1983. You switched from the Assembly to the Senate. How different was that?
I got to tell you, it was like moving from, I don't know, Mexico to Japan, you know, I mean, and no disrespect intended to Mexico, but it was just in the sense of the Assembly, 99 people, hurly-burly, yelling and shouting, party atmosphere, no sense of collegiality, and then the Senate, 33 members, was much more restrained, much more collegial, much more polite. And in fact, when I decided to run for the state Senate in 1982, I could have run for re-election to the Assembly. You know, I could probably have been re-elected to the Assembly for the rest of my life, and I'd be sitting here today, you know, after 40 years in the state Assembly. But I disliked it so much that the up or out option was very appealing to me. I was willing to give up a safe seat in the Assembly just to get out of the Assembly, and to risk it all by running for the state Senate, because a state Senate district was 3 Assembly districts, and it's a big jump. But I was thrilled to do it, and the change in culture for me made all the difference in the world. I think looking back, I shifted from being this sort of outlier, guy with no friends, guy who looked down on his colleagues, to being a real team player, a member of the majority party. I was much more productive in terms of passing legislation. I was much more productive as a committee chair because I was in the majority party. And I've got to tell you, my 2 terms in the Senate were just a pleasure. It was the highlight of my life. I feel fortunate to have been able to serve in the state Senate. I'm thankful for the opportunity, and thankful for having had the opportunity to do that in my 30s. You know, some people, they're pushing 40, they're pushing 50, they're pushing 60, they still haven't made their goal, and I was so lucky to be able to do it in my 30s. It was just a pleasure.
Why did you give it up?
You know, I had been in the state Senate for 2 terms. I had felt very productive, and then there had been a vacancy for Congress. And sort of the next logical step up after state Senate is Congress. And I started thinking about running for Congress. And then I realized that I had topped out in politics, because running for Congress, you really need serious money. You really needed, even back then, $250,000, $300,000, $400,000. And I have to tell you, I didn't have the vaguest idea how to raise $400,000. And I think my weaknesses as a politician came to the fore. You know, I called a businessman who was very wealthy, who had known my family, known my parents, and I thought this would be the easiest $1,000 contribution I could get. And he said, "What's your position on the minimum wage?" You know, in other words, he was asking me about his economic interest, to heck with family loyalty or friendship. And so at that moment, I really realized I had topped out. And so, did I want to stay in the state Senate for the rest of my life? Or if I was going to have another career, would it be better to do it in my early 40s, trying to make a career shift, rather than late 40s, early 50s, late 50s? And so in retrospect, it was a good decision. It was a really hard decision. I really missed the legislature. I missed public policy. But I was quickly able to find a position that was very, very satisfying in the nonprofit sector.
When you ran for the Senate, had an incumbent retired, or was there some opportunity like that?
Yes, indeed. An incumbent that retired, his name was David Berger, who was a state senator from the northwest side of the city of Milwaukee. And once again, I found myself running for the legislature against a guy who was being endorsed by the outgoing incumbent. Dave Berger endorsed another assemblyman from that district called Michael Kirby, a really good guy, and we had been friends. Endorsed Mike Kirby for his seat and not me. And so I found myself again running against a hand-picked successor, hand-picked guy chosen by the predecessor. And Mike and I really had an unpleasant summer because we had no animosity towards each other. And I won the primary again. It was a Democratic district, so winning the primary was essentially the same as getting elected. And then Mike and I were able to resume our friendship.
Was it just a two-way primary?
It was a three-way primary. There was the son of a judge running whose last name was Sullivan. And Milwaukee for 50 years had had judges by the name of Sullivan who were winning elections. It was a wonderful name to have, and so I was very intimidated. My fear that this name Sullivan, people would recognize this name Sullivan. And I was in pretty good shape in my home district, but that's only 1/3 of the whole Senate district. In fact, there was a reapportionment, so it was less than 1/3. But I spent the summer going door to door, and what I found again is exactly what happened to me when I first ran for the assembly. People remembered my name, this weird name, Mordecai Lee. Oh, I've heard of you. I saw you on TV. And
which you started using on purpose. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was in college, my name growing up was James Mordecai Lee. And so I was James M. Lee. And when I was in college, I had this sort of burst of Zionist enthusiasm and religious identification. I liked being Jewish, and the name James M. Lee didn't strike me as a way to say I love being Jewish. So it's the usual way in Wisconsin, the way you change your name is by going to court and getting a court order. And so I got a court order that deleted my first name James and made Mordecai my first name. And so I was Mordecai Lee. And so in college and graduate school, when I worked for Henry Royce, I was Mordecai Lee. I come back home to run for the state assembly in 1976. And I suddenly think, I made a mistake. This is going to be horrible, running with this weird conversation-stopping name. And so the first couple of weeks I was running for the state assembly, I sort of mumbled my name. Hi, I'm Lee. I tried to focus on Lee. And finally, only a few weeks after starting to campaign, for the very first time in my political career, a voter, a woman I remember it, turned to me and said, "Now that we've talked for a few minutes, I like you. I'm going to vote for you. And do you know how I'm going to remember to vote for you?" And I'm delighted. Besides my mother, I've now got 2 votes. And I said, why? She said, "I'm going to go down the column of the ballot until I find the guy with the weird name." And it was at that moment that I realized that Mordecai Lee was a good name for politics because it was memorable. And sometimes I've had people ask me, well, Mordecai is such a Jewish name. Did you ever have any anti-Semitism? And I remember one guy who said to me, Mordecai, are you Jewish? And I'm I'm getting ready for it. And I said, yeah, and I'm really proud of it. And he said, you got my vote. And only one time did I feel that I really lost a vote because I had such a Jewish name. A woman literally slammed the door in my face. She said, "You're Jewish." And so, even though growing up my grandparents told me stories about restricted covenants where Jews couldn't go to some hotels, or my dad talked about law firms in Milwaukee that wouldn't hire him with a Jewish name, by my generation, anti-Semitism in large part had petered out, and it was never a problem being Jewish, and I was very proud of my name.
What were the issues in the state Senate?
By the time I got to the state Senate, Wisconsin was facing major financial issues, and in that respect, it's very reminiscent of the very time right now that we're taping this issue.
We should set the stage. 1982, Governor Earl was elected, and the state faced a gigantic deficit, it sounds like today, and the first bill you voted on
was a tax increase.
$1 billion tax increase.
And John, I've heard a rumor that you have the pen that signed that tax increase, the last Wisconsin tax increase. Now,
if you want me to tell that. Tony Earl had just been elected governor. This was the first bill he signed, I believe, the very first one in January of '83 to cure this deficit, and it made the 5% sales tax permanent.
Right.
And that was the $1 billion tax increase. Well, he sat at his desk and he signed the bill. Ordinarily now, a governor, when he signs a bill, has all sorts of pens to give out to the co-sponsors who are, well, there's nobody standing behind him to get a pen from signing the tax increase, and he hadn't worked out a system, as later governors did, of having nice pens to give away to the people. You probably have many of them. So he used a standard issue state pen, a big pen that you buy by the grocer or something, and he signed the bill with it. And then after he left the pen on the table. And I thought, that isn't right. So I picked up the pen, took it into his outer office, had them type up an affidavit saying this is the pen that the governor used to sign the $1 billion tax increase, the date, and I've got that in an envelope. I'll give it to the Historical Society, or will it to the Historical Society. So I always say the pen is mightier than the sword. This big pen probably cost the state 8 cents buying in bulk, and it signed the $1 billion tax increase. But that was your first vote. That
was my first vote as a senator. And if we could just back up to spring of 1982, Governor Dreyfus is a Republican governor, a moderate Republican governor, and the state faced an initial deficit because 1982 was the beginning of the recession that got deeper and deeper and deeper later on. Sort of the Reagan recession in the middle of Reagan's first term. Then, of course, there was prosperity after that. So Lee Dreyfus, a moderate governor, is faced with having to close the deficit. And to indicate how different the times were, he decided that he would have a combined proposal of some spending cuts and a temporary tax increase. A Republican governor was proposing a temporary tax increase. It was the 5th cent on the sales tax that would just last for about a year and a half until the deficit was covered. And that shows you how much times have changed. And I voted for it. This is spring of '82. I turn around, I go back home to run for election to a higher office, and not a peep. It was never an issue. That really shows you how different the times were. And so, yes, I get elected to the state senate, spring of '83. The day that he becomes sworn in as governor, he signs a special session call for the legislature to convene. We vote on making the 5th cent permanent, and we voted on a 10% surcharge on the income tax that would last until the deficit would be covered. And again, I voted for it, and that's the pen you've got. And 3 years later, when I was running for a second term in the state senate, nary a peep. You know, it shows you how times have changed. And I think it was really Ronald Reagan who changed America. It was Ronald Reagan who really made the term tax increase a dirty word, to the point where now, 20 years later, in 2009, right across the street from where we're sitting right now, the legislature is dealing with a deficit, and they won't increase either the general sales tax and they won't increase the income tax. And the Democrats are the majority party in both houses, and that really shows you the sea change in how politics changed in our lifetimes.
Anti-tax sentiment, and those who are pushing anti-tax have obviously been very successful.
Right, so you've got a Democratic majority, you've got a Democratic member of the Senate and the Assembly saying, I don't want to go back home and have a Republican run against me that I increase taxes. And that's an indication of how much public opinion has changed in those 20 years.
I should add a footnote that when Lee Dreyfus announced the 5 cent, the 1 cent increase and called it temporary, hardly anybody believed him. I remember when that happened. He announced it in an evening press conference in the governor's conference room. And for my reaction to it, we'd broadcast it live on public radio. And for my first reaction, I went to Gerald Kletchka, who at the time was chair of the Joint Finance Committee, a representative from Milwaukee, later congressman. And his first words was, temporary? If he thinks this is temporary, he's... That was the first reaction. Of course, it wasn't temporary. But we should also add that that 10% income tax surcharge, believe it or not, did turn out to be temporary.
Yes, it was repealed.
People may think there is no such thing as a temporary tax.
But to give credit where credit is due, the legislation we passed in spring of '82 said the 5th cent on the sales tax will expire on such and such a date. And so Dreyfus, with a straight face, could say it was temporary. It was when Tony Earl convened us in that special session that we deleted that line, so that's when legally it became permanent.
Well, let's talk about the governors that you've served with, starting with, you came in at the tail end of Pat Lucey.
Right.
And then, of course, let's see, Martin Schreiber, Lee Dreyfus, Tony Earl, and Tommy Thompson. Quite a variety there. Tell us about the governors.
You know, what's amazing is how much personality affects power. You know, people think, well, every governor is equal or every president is equal. And for example, Pat Lucey liked public policy, and he was a detail person, and he really planned ahead. And most legislators didn't like him because he was so successful at getting what he wanted. And what really surprised me was, this was sort of politics 101 for me, is President Carter announced that he was going to name Pat Lucey to be ambassador to Mexico. And so Lucey becomes a lame duck. He's still governor. He signs the budget and casts some line item vetoes. And normally, whenever Governor Lucey had cast line item vetoes, they always were sustained by the legislature.
Democratic legislator, Democratic governor.
Because to a certain extent, those Democratic legislators were afraid of him, of what he could do to them. But now there was this novel situation in summer of 1977 where he was a lame duck. And every single one of his line item vetoes were overridden. And I remember State Representative Jonathan Berry saying, you know, something like, "Put that up your sombrero, Governor Lucey." And it made tangible to me this concept of political capital. But political power is in part due to what a person might become, what they might do to you in the future. You know, it's that future club. As soon as they knew that Pat Lucey was a lame duck, they weren't afraid of him anymore.
Martin Schreiber?
Marty Schreiber was in for only a year and a half. It was after Lucey resigned, and he was so quickly running for re-election that I think it's hard to say what kind of governor he would have been. But he was the state senator from the Sherman Park neighborhood, from where I came from. A very nice guy who wanted to do good, a really clean-cut Lutheran, you know, sort of a Wisconsin Lutheran. But he just wasn't in long enough to really leave a lasting legacy.
His father had been, what, on the city council or something like that for generations, so the name was
right, and it was very well known in Milwaukee. And in fact, his father was still an alderman when I ran in my first race in 1976. And I remember he was a constituent in that district. I remember ringing his doorbell, and I'm a total stranger. And he hears my spiel, and he says, "Come in," you know, and he seats me down in the living room. And he said, "Now, who are you?" And it took me a while to understand what Marty Schreiber's father meant. He meant, "Who are your parents? Do I know your parents?" And then he said, "Who are your grandparents?" And it turned out he knew my mother's father, my maternal grandfather. And he said, "Oh, I remember him. Okay, you got my vote." So that was a real example of the Schreiber family having good memory.
And all politics is local? Is that
exactly.
what it boils down to? Well, he was only in for 2 years, and then less than 2 years, and then the phenomenon of Dreyfus hit. What's your take on Lee Dreyfus?
You know, everybody has certain cards they've been dealt in terms of their character and their background and their skills. And Governor Lucey was a relatively shy person. He was not a good backslapper, but he really liked policy. In a sense, Lee Dreyfus was the mirror image of Lucey. By mirror image, I mean the opposite. Governor Dreyfus was a very gregarious person. He loved being around people. He got a high by being around people. But he was bored to tears by policy, by the mundane policy. Of course, you know, big issues, big decisions, he understood he had to make it. And he was just sort of an idea machine. He was sort of a walking press conference. And, you know, I'm sure you remember, John. He would just toss out ideas and get an interesting headline and never had a follow-up because it was just an idea. So I think it turned out, especially because this was the Reagan recession that began in 81 and 82, that Dreyfus didn't enjoy the job very much. And everybody was assuming he'd run for re-election. But once he had to figure out how to deal with the deficit, and we've talked in the earlier segment about the temporary 5th cent on the sales tax, I think that was it for him. He just didn't like being in politics, and so he voluntarily did not run for re-election and created a vacancy.
And that really threw the Republicans in a tizzy when he announced, it was late in spring, I believe.
That's right.
Was it April or May?
That's right.
Before the election, that he announced he wasn't going to run again, and that caught the other Republicans by surprise. In fact, I've never seen Tommy Thompson more angry. He was at that time minority leader of the Assembly, and he realized, how are we going to get a candidate and a campaign in the remaining 5 months or whatever it was to the election?
And you know, what I think is unclear to the public at large is how much behind the scenes work there is in a campaign. The campaigns start a year out, 2 years out. You have to raise money, you have to create a finance committee, you start identifying supporters. There's a lot of organizing behind the scenes. And so when Tommy was so angry at Lee Dreyfus for dropping out of the re-election race so late, it was late. Because if anybody had known that there would be a vacancy, a year earlier they would have started organizing. And so eventually, if I recall correctly, Terry Kohler was the Republican nominee. He was a relatively wealthy man, so he could self-finance. So he didn't have the problem of needing a long time span to raise money. But he was a terrible candidate. I think there was an interview with, maybe it was Neil Shively of the Milwaukee Sentinel at the time, where I think he said something to the effect of, all these details, I confuse them sometimes.
He said something like, in a budget, talking about the budget,
Right.
I don't understand the numbers.
Right, exactly. And
I can't remember the context, but that was taken up.
that really killed him. And so Tony Earl, who is a former legislator, who is a very nice guy, very likable guy, really was in the perfect position. And that's probably one of the reasons that he won that election in 1982. Right.
Now, Dreyfus campaigned really on one issue, give back the state budget surplus. Now, to people watching in 2009, the idea that there was a state budget surplus may seem outlandish, but there was. How did that go?
You know, in the hindsight of history, we can see all these mistakes. And I like the way you described it. Marty Schreiber is running for election for a full term as governor. The state has a surplus. Now, one would think that having a surplus is a good thing, but no, it was a bad thing. Lee Dreyfus ran on the issue of, well, they're lousy money managers and financial managers and budgeteers because there's a surplus. I'll give back the surplus. It's the people's money. So he gets elected, and the very first legislative issue after he's elected in early 1979 was give back the surplus. And within 2 years, Wisconsin went from prosperity to recession, from a surplus to a deficit. So 2 years later, 3 years later, Dreyfus is now regretting that he gave back the surplus because now he has to increase taxes, the 5th cent on the tax. And you would think that people would learn from this because about 15 years later, the exact same thing happened. And still, the temptation of giving back a surplus is overwhelming to politicians at the moment.
Well, he also said that he wanted the state to be in a situation of fiscal brinksmanship because that would limit the state spending and make spending more wiser and so forth. Fiscal brinksmanship, be careful what you ask for, I guess, because you might get it. We certainly have had it ever since, haven't we?
Right, and he got fiscal brinksmanship in spades, and one could say that his moment of truth was when he decided that given that there was a deficit, that he would solve the deficit not exclusively with spending cuts, but partly with the tax increase, that 5th cent on the sales tax. And so his fiscal brinksmanship led to himself recommending a temporary tax increase. You know, he had a great quip. He said, government does not have a reverse gear. Government only grows in size. Government only gets more expensive. And I think there's a real kernel of truth to what he said. But he still wasn't willing to only cut spending. He asked for a tax increase.
And like it or not, whether it's been planned or not, the state has really been in a situation of fiscal brinksmanship, it seems, ever since. Every budget, of course the current one that we're talking about right now in 2009 is really in big trouble because of the recession, but all the budgets have been barely balanced or balanced by accounting tricks and so forth ever since.
You know, there was a roller coaster in terms of ups and downs that follows the national economy. And during Tommy's administration, I think this would be about 10 years ago. I think this would be about the mid-90s or later in the 90s. Just like the federal government started having surpluses, state governments started having surpluses. And it was the same argument. Do they keep the surplus for a rainy day or not? And Tommy finally went with giving most of it back. And so they sent out things that were the size of a check. And it was like a couple $100s. And within a couple of years, America went from prosperity to recession. And everybody regretted giving back the surplus.
And so Marty Schreiber didn't really have that much of a chance to establish himself. He was kind of hit by a whirlwind that came out of nowhere in the form of Lee Dreyfus, who had no prior political experience, really, though of course he always said and I'll ask you about this later since you have a professorial appointment now. One of Davis's favorite sayings was that the politics in the legislature is nothing compared to the cutthroat politics in a faculty department at a university. So we'll hold that in abeyance because we'll go through the governors first, I guess. But so we're up to Tony Earl. What did you think?
Tony Earl had been a fabulous politician when he was in the State Assembly. He was very well liked. He got along with everybody. In fact, I think it was in only his second term as the Assemblyman from Wausau that he was elected Majority Leader, which is a phenomenal expression of confidence. But it was sort of like the moment he got elected governor, he lost all his political instincts, and he only made decisions based on public policy. And he sort of, it's like he stopped campaigning. It's sort of like he stopped using the governor's office to look good, to self-publicize himself. And he made lots of good decisions, but politically, they weren't such good decisions. Like the fight over where to locate a prison in the Milwaukee area. Should the prison be near what was then Milwaukee County Stadium, where the Brewers played? This is just before Miller Park was built. And Tony sort of became tone deaf on politics of issues. And the business sector in Wisconsin really mounted a campaign saying that Wisconsin was a terrible place to do business, and it was all the fault of these big spenders and big taxers like Tony Earl, and we needed an economic development strategy, and we needed a Republican there. And so Tony sort of got caught up in these machinations, and so running for re-election in 1986, he was defeated by Tommy Thompson, who was a relatively unknown state assemblyman from Elroy.
The Milwaukee County Stadium, or the prison near Milwaukee County Stadium. Tell us about that.
Well,
the proposal for one.
Right. This was very much about the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. That there were so many places that said, we don't want a prison is a bad thing. But there are a lot of rural areas in Wisconsin who said, well, we think of a prison as a jobs kind of situation. It'll hire a couple hundred of our people, and it's not dangerous because they're all locked inside. And Tony, I think fairly, Tony Earl said, well, rightly or wrongly, a disproportionate population of the prison system are African Americans. And they come from the Milwaukee area. And if we take them a couple hundred miles from their families, it'll be easier for them to become hardened criminals and recidivists. Whereas if they're close to where their families are, if their families can take a bus to visit them, if it's in the Milwaukee area, they retain their familial ties, they retain their parental roles. It would be easier for them to go good when they get out. But he couldn't find a neighborhood in Milwaukee that would agree to it. And he tried half a dozen sites, and one of them was the Menominee Valley in central Milwaukee, which was just to the east of where the ballpark was and is. And Bud Selig, then the owner of the Brewers, just hit the roof. And
so did John Norquist, then mayor of Milwaukee, if I remember.
I'm trying to remember, what year John was elected, and I can't remember if we're talking about 1986. I think Mayor Meyer was still mayor in 1986. I think John was elected mayor in 1988.
But anyway, the mayor jumped in too.
The mayor jumped in. The mayor, Mayor Henry Meyer, the longtime mayor of Milwaukee, who hated Tony Earl for not giving enough money in shared revenue to Milwaukee, egged on the opponents of the prison, was against the prison, and then covertly supported Tommy Thompson for governor. And Tommy Thompson ran this relatively primitive ad that showed the sort of prison dropping right down next to the ballpark, and it became very successful in obtaining support in the Milwaukee area. And to Tommy's campaign surprise, it was very successful outstate. That people identified with the Brewers, they understood the issue, and so Tommy ran against Tony for half a dozen reasons, but this prison location next to the Milwaukee Brewers ballpark was one of the big issues.
That ad, I remember it very well. It was crude, as you say. Now we have all the special effects, but it was a cutout of the Waupun State Prison, which is 150 years old or something like that. This castle comes down right next to the picture of, but of course the prison that was proposed wasn't anything like that.
Right.
It was going to be a one-story building that was kind of down in the valley. You wouldn't have been able to see it from the stadium or the stadium parking lot, but everybody knew it would be there.
And in fact, the joke was at the time is, what is Bud Selig afraid of? If you got this prison a mile away, is he afraid that people are going to escape to go to a free ball game. You know, I mean, no one could quite understand it, but psychologically, Bud thought it was a bad association. It was just too near the ballpark.
Now, at the same time that the city of Milwaukee and Bud Selig and the mayor and seemingly most everybody in Milwaukee hated this idea of putting a prison there, small towns were asking for it.
Exactly.
And Dreyfus started that. Dreyfus started the prison building. And he said, I'll put it where they want it.
Exactly.
And Portage stepped up to be the first city, right. And so we have the prison. And then later...
The Supermax.
Later, Boscobel and
right.
Ladysmith. Anyway, they've been built as economic development in these small towns. So the small towns are all want them, and the city didn't.
And that's a really perfect example of how Tony Earl was tone deaf politically. In terms of public policy, he was right. If the predominant majority of the prison population are African American from Milwaukee, it's a good idea in terms of rehabilitation that a prison be in Milwaukee so that families can retain ties. I mean, it just made all the sense in the world. But it was horrible politics, and Tony would not let go of it, and Tommy ran with it.
And your assessment of Tommy Thompson?
You know, when I remember Tommy as the assistant minority leader in the Assembly, and I served with him for 3 terms.
And then he served 20 years in the Assembly.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he became governor, and I couldn't recognize that it was the same person. And I say that as a compliment, because when he was an assemblyman, we thought of him as pretty lazy intellectually and lazy in terms of work habits, and just sort of full of, when he would get up to speak, it would be just sort of standard cliches. He had never studied issues, you know. And then all of a sudden he becomes governor, and he became a different person, and an impressively a different person. He became a workaholic, he became a policy nerd, he became a very powerful leader who really was able to rein in state government to do what he said. It was an impressive transformation, and I really think that he deserves credit for what he accomplished by transforming himself and then by using that personal transformation to be a fabulous governor.
I've always said that he earned his popularity the hard way by the gubernatorial equivalent of door-to-door campaigning. One of the first things that he did with his administration, and James Clauser, his administration secretary, was they got a good, faster airplane for the governor to travel around in.
Right.
And that was, some people frowned on that as a frill, but he used it not only to travel to Washington occasionally and things like that, but to go around the state. And he worked, as you say, he was a workaholic, constantly traveling around the state and meeting people and going to, and so he earned the popularity the hard way.
And you know, that's an example. If we've been talking about these different personalities of governors, Tommy is an example of a guy who was good on policy and good on politics. I mean, I've seen him work crowds after he became governor, and it was just unbelievable. His memory for names, his being at ease with people. And what's so hard to reconstruct is what a nobody Tommy was at the beginning. When he was still in the Assembly, there was a vacancy for Congress when Congressman Steiger died. This is sort of the Fond du Lac area, central Wisconsin. And Tommy ran for it, you know, Republican primary, and lost the primary to Tim Petri, who then became the congressman. And still is. And still is.
As we record this.
That's right. And so by the time Tommy then turned around and ran for governor about 1.5 years later, nobody paid much attention to him. Everybody thought he was a nobody. But he wins the primary and then becomes this fabulous politician. And so he got what he earned through the hard work of his own.
And I have to bring up the quote, Jonathan Berry, who'd been a Democratic state representative, was his opponent in the primary for the Republican gubernatorial nomination. And Berry at one point called him the hick from Elroy.
Right.
And that stuck, and it hurt Berry, not Tommy Thompson, right?
It's just amazing. Tommy became such a disciplined politician. And so years later, when he did the stick it to Milwaukee thing about paying for the new Brewer Stadium, that was actually the exception to the rule. More often than not, he was very controlled publicly, and he was always for compromise, and he was always looking for bridges to the Democratic Party. He was a fabulous politician.
One thing of politicians that I've observed about politicians, many of them who become very successful, senators, governors, and so forth, one thing they seem to have in common is a extremely high energy level.
Yes.
Many of them are workaholics, and this just fabulous energy level. You show them a crowd, and they're on, 18 hours a day while campaigning. that's almost a prerequisite.
I think so. I mean, nowadays we use the phrase a type A personality. And to be successful in politics, you do have to be a people person, whether it comes naturally to you or not. You have to plunge into the crowd. You have to work, from sunup to sundown. You don't say no to an interview at midnight. You always return phone calls from reporters. You accept as many speaking invitations as you can. And you're right, John, that in a sense, it's survival of the fittest. That the ones who become presidents or governors or U.S. senators are those type A personalities who, in a sense, are obsessed. And I mean that in a positive sense, not in the sense of OCD or something like that, obsessive-compulsive syndrome, that they're obsessed with winning. They set aside the rest of their lives. They set aside their family, their vacations, earning money, just to win an election. And those are the ones who are successful politicians.
When you think of a Bill Proxmire, for instance, shook every hand in the state 6 times, I think, during all the times that he ran for re-election. And even as a U.S. Senator with a 6-year term. When he came back to Wisconsin, find the biggest crowd in the vicinity and go and shake hands.
When he's, let's say, 1 year into a 6-year term.
Yeah.
And when he's 2 years into a 6-year term. I mean, he was an astoundingly successful politician.
And of course, what you said, your first election, going door to door.
Right.
Takes a lot of time, but that's still the surest way to get elected to the assembly.
Right. And just to sort of give you an indication, I mean, I would come home after, let's say, 8 hours of door to door, exhausted. Sleep well, get up in the morning, have a high protein, high fat breakfast, bacon and butter, and I would burn it off in the day. I mean, because that's how much energy it took and the concentration it took.
Let's talk about, do you have any more remarks about Tommy Thompson? Of course, nearly 16 years, by far the longest serving governor. How did he manage that?
It was that transformation from being this sort of hack conservative, for lack of a better term, to being a moderate Republican who wanted to do things. For the conservative Republicans, their goal is, in a sense, to stop government. They're anti. But Tommy created a niche, in a sense, created the Republican Party to be a party that was in favor of doing things. It's just that it was in favor of doing things that were supported by the principles of conservatism. So, for example, he's the guy who came up with W-2, reform welfare, not by being mean to people and not by shutting it down, but by coming up with a constructive alternative to it. So Tommy really embodied a kind of a Disraeli conservative, to use the British phrase. Benjamin Disraeli being a conservative, but he was for things. And Tommy figured out how to do that, and I think that was his brilliance.
When he believed that it was worthwhile to spend money, that there would be a payback, he didn't hesitate.
What's amazing is that government spending consistently went up under Tommy's administrations, but it was never a political issue. Republicans were willing to let that pass because he was using the bonanza of money from good times and federal aid. He was using it to accomplish conservative goals. And so, in a sense, he figured out a way to not have to be this person who just obsessed about spending levels.
And would you agree he focused on the economic side rather than the social side? That is to say, he certainly signed bills to restrict abortion, for example, but he didn't propose them. He was more interested in what you might call the Main Street economic republicanism sort of thing. Is that a fair characterization?
Sort of, if the term economic development killed Tony Earl, that he was viewed as anti-business, then the lesson Tommy took from that was that he was in favor of anything that could be called economic development. And so I think the way you described him, John, was right on target. He was Mr. Business Growth, Mr. Job Creation. So everything that he worked hard on was under this umbrella of economic development, whether it's reforming welfare so that you have people who can take jobs, whether it's tax credit for businesses so they create more jobs. It was always economic development. And that became, in a sense, a nonpartisan kind of campaign theme. Because Democrats and Republicans were all in favor of economic development. They might disagree about the details. But Tommy successfully straddled a power of that to be a partisan issue and made it a nonpartisan issue.
In the sense of being anti-tax and pro-business, have the Democrats mimicked the Republicans?
This is a great time to talk about it because Governor Doyle is the first governor since Tommy Thompson stepped down and then Scott McCallum was briefly the lieutenant governor who became governor. That I would almost describe Governor Doyle as a Democrat, as being a Thompson Democrat. in the sense that Governor Doyle, under absolutely no situation, will propose an increase in general taxes. Not an increase in the sales tax and not an increase in the income tax. He doesn't care how much state spending has to be. He will not support a tax increase. So, in a sense, Tommy pulled Wisconsin politics to the right. And so we've got a Democratic governor who is not the typical liberal, big spending governor. He's a governor who's against tax increases, who's for cutting spending. So Doyle is really the son of Tommy Thompson.
Do you like the direction the Democrats have taken?
You know, I guess I'm an old 60s liberal, and in the stories that we talked about earlier in this conversation, I voted for tax increases. I believe in government. My PhD is in public administration. I think the government has a role that it can play better than business. So I'm in favor of a substantial government. So I guess in that respect, I'm in disagreement with where public opinion is, even Democratic public opinion. But, you know, we should emphasize to the listeners to this that right now I'm a state employee, and last week I found out that a 2% raise I was going to get next Monday was repealed, and I found out that I was not going to get a pay raise for 2 years, and I found out that I was going to have to take 16 furlough days. And so in that respect, I suppose somebody could discredit my criticism of saying, well, he's just being self-interested. But I think I'm paid nicely. I really am not complaining about my salary level. But I do think there are aspects of government that are being underfunded now because everybody now is against the tax increase. Nobody wants to be accused of voting for a tax increase.
Now, starting with Ronald Reagan, we were told that government is the problem. Government couldn't run a two-car funeral, I think, was one of Reagan's favorite sayings, and that seems to be permeating today. But is it loosening up now that we've had the economic debacle of recent months as we speak? Has that changed that attitude that government is always the problem? Now we seem to be needing it.
You know, I'm not sure. After all, it was President Clinton, who's a decade after President Reagan, who said the era of big government is over. And this is a liberal Democratic president saying that he's no longer in favor of big government. So I think you're right that Ronald Reagan pulled the entire American sort of civic culture to the right, if you get a Clinton saying that. But now we're in the beginning months of President Obama's administration, and he's talking about tax increases for the highest income brackets. And in fact, Governor Doyle is in favor of a tax increase only for the highest brackets, not for the middle class. And so maybe, John, you're right. Maybe we're at a pivot of history where American public opinion is accepting that in some cases government is underfunded and government needs to be better funded, and therefore would they support a tax increase. And so it'll be interesting over the next couple of elections. Republicans will say that Obama and Governor Doyle increased taxes, in other words, on the highest bracket. Democrats will say we only increased it on the rich. So it'll be interesting where public opinion falls. Will they be in support of that or against that?
And right now, it looks at the moment as we speak that government may be necessary. After all, it's bailing out banks and Chrysler and General Motors, and it appears right now as if government is necessary.
John,
I don't know, I'm not saying they're doing it the right way. But,
no, John, I have to tell you, I believe in government. I believe in public service. You know, my dad was a businessman and was very successful at it. And my two grandfathers were businessmen and very successful at it. And growing up, I had no interest in business. And I mean, I think entrepreneurism is sort of a natural human nature. Right? You go back in history and people were trading, you know, 2,000 years ago, they were trading with the Far East and stuff like that. I think the role of government is to step in when the marketplace doesn't work. And so the argument, in a sense, between Democrats and Republicans, and where I fall, is that I see situations where the marketplace does not work and government does have to intervene, whereas Republicans rarely see that. So I guess my choice of having a PhD in public administration, the political choices I made when I was a politician, what I believe in today is that I do believe in government. I do believe that government has a major role to play in the political economy.
Now, I want to ask before we're done about university relations with the legislature, which have been strained.
Yes.
I'm trying to look for a polite word. Since you've seen it from both sides, And this goes way back to when you were in the legislature,
yes, it does.
right? Talk about the relationship between the state government and the legislature and the university system.
Well, I have to tell you, when I was a legislator, I felt that the University of Wisconsin was this bottomless pit that would suck up money from the state taxpayers. It was sort of this Vietnam of state government, to use a 1960s example, or sort of an Iraq of government, to use a 1990s and 2000 example, that they always wanted more money. The university always complained that the professors were underpaid. And they were just, for lack of a better term, whiners. And in 1989, I was the co-chair of the Joint Audit Committee, which is the joint committee of the State Senate and State Assembly that oversees the Legislative Audit Bureau. And the arguments got so fierce about if professors were underpaid or not, that we asked the Legislative Audit Bureau to do a disinterested audit to tell us if the statistics we were getting from the university were good statistics or not. And they came back with a devastating audit. This is now about the spring of 1989, saying that the university statistics were not reliable and that they were using sort of self-serving examples and non-comprehensive examples, and that pay rates weren't that inequitable. Now, to me, I thought that that was the moment when everything would change. But to my surprise, the university stayed quiet for a couple of months and then picked up exactly where they left off. And there was no institutional history. And so the university, a year later, started saying, well, we're underpaid, we need to have a major catch-up pay raise. And it's like that audit disappeared into a black hole or a bottomless well. And so now, again, here we are 20 years later, the university is saying they're not getting enough money, and in fact, Governor Doyle is cutting the amount of tax dollars that they're getting. And I think this is really a moment of truth, and I think the argument isn't being framed correctly, and I'll tell you what I think the argument should be. I think the argument should be, what should state taxpayers pay for? And it seems to me that a state taxpayer should pay for a university that educates their kids, and that we should not be paying for salaries for expensive professors who teach very little and who self-righteously say they have to do research. My answer to them, if I were God for a day, if I were governor for a day, I would say, if you want to do research, fine, but we, the state taxpayers, are only going to pay you for the hours you teach. And so I think that is the moment of truth. Why are the Wisconsin taxpayers paying for a world-class research institution? I think we should be paying for a garden variety teaching institution. And that would justify a state subsidy, not the other stuff.
Well, I suppose you could argue that the old state university system, the four-year campuses, are the garden variety teaching institutions, while Madison is a world-renowned, in fact, one of the leading world research institutions. Is that a bad thing? That Madison is that way?
Believe it or not, I'm going to say yes. And I know this sounds anti-intellectual, but let me give you an example. For the average professor in my field in the old state university system, nowadays, the teaching load is usually 3 courses a semester. For the 2 doctoral institutions, Madison and Milwaukee, I'm at Milwaukee, the teaching load is 2 courses a semester. Now, I have to tell you with some embarrassment that teaching 2 courses a semester is not a full-time job. And that it seems to me that we should pay professors to teach. And so if they want to teach 2 courses a semester instead of 3 or 4, I think we should pay them, let's say, 50% of their salary or 75% of their salary, but not 100% of their salary. Now, I know this is going against my economic self-interest because I've become a historian of government. I've written a couple of books that were histories of government.
You're a researcher, too.
I'm a researcher, and I'm just in that situation. I'm criticizing myself. I don't think I should be paid to write history books about the Roosevelt administration or the Nixon administration. I think I should only be paid to teach. And so that really is what it seems to me the argument is about. To some extent, they are separated. I mean, the bulk of the universities, well, UW-Madison is down to less than 20% state support. Its total budget at Madison. And I believe system-wide it's 25% or a little less, the money that comes from state taxpayers. The UW-Madison is already largely privatized, isn't it? Right. It's almost like, say, a Northwestern. Northwestern University down in Chicago is not part of state government. It's a nonprofit institution. It's a private nonprofit corporation that's a kind of a self-perpetuating corporation. And so University of Wisconsin-Madison would like to be like that. They'd like to sort of go private. They'd like to become a nonprofit agency. And so the argument, you're right, John, is how much money do the state taxpayers owe a university to be a world-class research institution instead of being a teaching institution? But for some reason, the argument never gets framed that way. So in a sense, we're not arguing about the right things nowadays.
Well, some have brought this up. I mean, Steve Nuss, the Republican legislator who's still in, who was head of the Education Committee when the Republicans had the majority in the Assembly, has been very antagonistic. He's led the antagonism, I think, to the university. And he said similar things, that they ought to teach. Forget about this research, what they all ought to teach. That's been attacked from the other side as you say, anti-intellectual.
Right, and for some reason, legislators are afraid of being accused of being anti-university, or to use the magic phrase, anti-academic freedom. You know, professors quickly invoke that flag. Oh, you're invading my academic freedom because you're telling me to do X, Y, Z. I think Knox was an outlier, you know, in the sense of that he had very little support. He spoke for very few people, that most legislators, whether Democrats or Republicans, do not want to take on the university. They don't want to be accused of killing the university or being anti-intellectual, being against academic freedom. And that's a shame because it suffocates debate on the merits.
So what should the university now does, Madison I'm talking about, does bring in hundreds of millions of dollars in grants, federal grants, foundation grants for its research. This is an economic benefit to the state, isn't it?
I think that's great, but the question is how much state subsidy should there be? If a professor gets a grant and ends up, let's say, not teaching at all because he or she lives off the grant, I think that's a wonderful thing. But I don't think we should be paying part of that person's salary. I think that person should be 100% on a grant for whatever grant that they can generate. I think we should only pay faculty to teach. And I guess I'm lucky I have tenure because now that I've said that,
academic freedom.
You know, my chancellor is going to be so mad at me for what I just said, and the regents are going to be so mad at me. But that is my opinion. Although I realize again I'm an outlier. I'm not representing the more consensus opinion.
But you have academic freedom.
Yeah, I have academic freedom to criticize myself.
Now, if the university funding it's below 20%, let's say it's 18%. I don't know what the exact figure is at this moment. If that's just enough to cover the teaching side of things, that would be the right amount.
I think, yes, if we were to calculate how much state money would go to the university, if we were to say we've calculated that for a professor to be paid to teach a course, or 2 courses, or 3 courses, I think then we'd have a great formula to decide how much state money should go to the university.
In terms of public relations, if you were the president of the university system, or on the Board of Regents, what advice would you have to the university to improve its image if it needs that, or convince people that it needs more money? What should the university do?
I think the university needs a cultural change from the inside. You know, I'm a colleague of 1,000 professors at UWM, and they don't see themselves as in public service. You know, public service means trying to improve Wisconsin in some tangible way. They just think of themselves, I'm a sociologist, I'm an anthropologist, I write these arcane articles. It seems to me that if the professoriate could change its orientation, we have to do things that we're being paid for by the taxpayers, that help the taxpayers, that help the state. Then I think the university would have credibility coming to the legislature and saying, this is the money we need from you because it does help the state. Right now it's a much more amorphous argument.
The university has been doing things like that for generations. University extension, starting with correspondence courses and now online, and extension with the county agents and the Wisconsin idea. The university has been doing some of these things, and certainly people ought to know about those if they don't, and yet maybe people don't know about that sort of thing.
You know, you were a member of Extension when you were part of the Wisconsin Public Radio, and I'm partly affiliated with Extension because I'm in the School of Continuing Education of UWM. And so you and I have been engaged in, I guess, what would be called popular education. But the professors look down their noses at people like us who are trying to make the world a better place. They score points on these uppity professors by, you know, writing an article about an arcane issue in an academic journal that has a subscription of 200 people, that nobody reads, that doesn't improve the state, that's not involved in public service. And that's the trap. We as the taxpayers should not be paying for that kind of activity. We should only be paying for what helps our state, whether it's by teaching or by public service.
Now, in science, for example, there's the argument over basic research.
Right.
Sometimes you don't know where it's going to go. Somebody has to do the basic research, and you're not sure. It might turn out to be a bonanza that helps everybody in the world a decade from now, or it might be a dead end. Somebody's got to pay for that, don't they?
Yeah, and let it be foundations and the federal government, the National Institutes of Health, or whatever it might be, the National Endowment for the Humanities. But the state taxpayers, I clearly come down on the side, if you're doing applied research that would help farmers, you're doing applied research that would help grow a specific crop, that would help doctors in Wisconsin, that's great. But we're not going to pay for basic research. For that, you have to get outside dollars.
And right now, the cuts to the university that are being proposed in the budget, as we speak, it came out of the Joint Finance Committee, I think 300 million more additional cut beyond what was already done for the whole system. Is this necessary? Is this the right way to go?
You know what, again, I'd be stripped of tenure if they could, because I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to say yes, that is the right way to go. I think the university could take those cuts. But the problem is that the way I see those cuts being implemented is it's trying to preserve the infrastructure. Just by nicking and cutting, 1% here, 2% there, as opposed to a cultural change. We're going to shut down the College of XYZ. We're going to close the institute for something. That's hard to do bureaucratically. And so instead, they're trying to maintain the infrastructure with just $300 million less, and that's really unsustainable.
Was it while you were still I believe it was when you were a senator, that there were serious proposals to close campuses? And, well, I think people can probably guess what happened. That one campus was closed, the smallest two-year center. And you proposed, even though we have, 3 or 4 institutions within a few miles of each other in the northeast, or northwest, the idea of closing a campus is a non-starter, to say the least.
Which is an example of the interplay between politics and the university, or between the legislature and the university, that it's like trying to close a library in a city. The alderman from that neighborhood is against it. In this case, in the state legislature, the state senator and state assemblyman from that particular district will fight tooth and nail, will use every trick in the book to protect their campus. And so that's why it's really a political non-starter for the university to propose shutting down a campus. And
yet, if you wanted this starting from scratch reform, you have to look at those sorts of things, but apparently it can't be done.
There's no doubt about it. We have way too many campuses, we have way too many facilities, and we should shrink in size.
Let's ask about the rest of the state budget, because I'm not sure the general public understands that the state does not spend most of the money that it raises. Most of the money goes back to other organizations which spend the money. The biggest by far is school aids to K through 12 education, and then $1 billion for shared revenue to local governments, $1 billion to the University of Wisconsin's medical assistance, over $2 billion.
Right.
So those are, the school aids, the shared revenue, and the medical assistance. These are spent by somebody else. They're very difficult for the state to control. But that's what has caused, more than anything, the budget problem.
I'm going to have to spend 10 seconds on a boring history lecture. That most people forget that when Wisconsin enacted the income tax about 100 years ago, the basic deal was that the state would have a state income tax because it was progressive. It was based on the ability to pay. But that the state was promising that much of the income tax revenue would flow back to the municipalities, back to local government, so that they wouldn't be as reliant on the property tax, because the property tax does not reflect the ability to pay.
And that's why aid to local governments is still called shared revenue, not aid like school aids.
Exactly. And so to a certain extent, when cities say, or counties say, school districts, we have a right to a substantial portion of the state budget, they're correct. But sometimes people forget the history. Sometimes they think, well, the state government should hold on to all its money. Why is it wasting it on those property tax levying governments?
And yet shared revenue has been essentially frozen for quite a few years now as we speak, so that inflation has eaten away at it. It's actually been shrinking consistently for a long time. Now, if this is shared revenue, of the state sharing its revenue, part of a bargain, The state is not keeping up the bargain as far as the cities and counties are concerned. Maybe it is with the school districts, with the two-thirds promise to pay two-thirds of school costs. But
I think you're right on target, and it is my opinion that state government has sort of been walking away, creeping away from this century-old commitment that it would use the income tax to funnel money back to property, so that property taxes wouldn't have to be so high. And you're right that really beginning with Tommy, shared revenue started shrinking, and aid to schools, supposedly it was going to be two-thirds of local costs, but that was really expensive and hard to maintain. So I think that everything is askew right now, and when you've got a political situation where no one will increase taxes, then that century-old bargain of giving a fair amount to local governments becomes harder and harder to keep, and that's exactly what's happening across the street from us literally today.
With the Joint Finance Committee
Right.
just acting last night as we talk about this.
This morning, actually.
This morning, yeah, well, late night hour, yeah, I guess. So that part
Right.
that part of legislating, I assume you don't miss.
Oh,
The late night sessions.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I miss public policy. I miss being a player. I miss being able to stand up and say, this is a giveaway to a special interest group. This is screwing the public. I miss trying to make a difference. But I don't miss, the emotion of a budget. The yelling and screaming and the predictable things. Or earlier we talked about abortion as a perennial issue. I don't miss the perennial argument about the budget. So in that respect, I guess I'd say that I'm part of my past, but there's a lot like fundraising and socializing that I don't miss. And so as a professor of government, maybe I've got it both ways. I'm still a little bit of a participant in public policy, but I'm out of the political scene.
Talking about taxes, as you say, a politician proposing a general tax increase, apparently they all think that's just poison. Nobody's willing to do that. But other tax increases are discussed, and there are a couple in the budget, more limited ones. And one, of course, that makes the headlines, I have to ask you about the beer tax. You're from Milwaukee. Wisconsin has the lowest, third lowest beer tax in the country, hasn't been raised since 1969. Now, even if it were quadrupled, it wouldn't make more than a drop in the bucket difference to the overall state budget. But there seems to be an impossible deal here, that it's impossible to increase the beer tax, which is right now less than a penny on a 12-ounce beer. You're not surprised at that?
I am surprised by that. I mean, I don't understand why it's so hard to increase the beer tax. I mean, we increase all the other sin taxes.
Yeah, we've boosted the cigarette tax hugely.
And why there's such a deeply felt tradition that they're not going to increase the beer tax? I mean, is the Tavern League that powerful? Milwaukee only has one brewery left. Milwaukee is not the world source of beer. I don't understand it, and maybe that's an example of why I was a lousy politician, because I would have voted in a split second to increase the beer tax, and yet, as you've said, just over the last couple of weeks there have been huge arguments about it, and the majority of the political establishment will not touch the topic, and I don't understand why.
For some reason, there's been no change in societal attitudes toward alcohol.
Yeah.
When I read the headlines here in Madison, we often have the headlines about the binge drinking problem on campus, and I read them and I say, how is this different from, well, I guess you already know that I'm older than you are, since 1962 when I came to campus, when it was exactly the same thing. Now, on the other hand, attitudes towards smoking have changed entirely.
Right.
I remember you talk about the caucus, the raucous caucus was often the Democratic majority when you were in. I remember when Joanne Duran proposed banning smoking in the North Hearing Room, the Democratic caucus in the mid-70s. She was laughed down. Now the whole building is smoke-free. How did that happen?
That's so great of you to mention that, because it's an indication for people to see that change can happen. And in my opinion, that was change for good. That there can be social progress. But why there could be so much progress on the issue of cigarettes and tobacco and not on alcohol? For example, Wisconsin not only has a low beer tax, it has a very weak drunk driving law. It has one of the weakest anti-drunk driving laws in terms of penalties and punishments of all the states. And yet, even after the Milwaukee Journal ran an extensive campaign about how weak our laws are and how awful it is, what happens, these tragedies on the road, right now across the street, it's very hard to get any reform, any toughening of the drunk driving laws. And so that's another example of something that has not changed. And again, I don't understand why. I don't understand why Wisconsin culture is so much more tolerant of alcohol abuse.
It's traditional, for one thing. I mean, it goes way, way back. But I'm thinking over the years, a few legislators have been nailed for drunk driving. Is it there, but for the grace of God, go I, that it could be me if we increase these penalties?
You know, I remember when I was in the legislature, and I would not touch a drop of alcohol if I was going to drive. I mean, I was a fanatic about it. And
you're not a teetotaler, though.
No, I'm not a teetotaler. I enjoy wine, I enjoy hard liquor, I enjoy beer. And I found myself, the only times I would actually drink would be when I was on vacation out of the state. You know, I was sort of off duty, I was away from constituents, I was certainly not getting behind the wheel. So you're right that legislators often see other people getting in trouble for drunk driving. They don't want it to happen to them. Now, whether the lesson they learn is that means they don't want to toughen drunk driving laws, that would be the wrong lesson to learn. It seems to me that it's an issue of personal behavior, of them choosing never to put themselves in a situation of drunk driving.
Of course, many legislators are in a situation where they do an awful lot of driving. As you mentioned earlier, the huge geographical districts, not only
Right.
driving to Madison back and forth once a week, but within their districts, there are legislators who put more mileage on their cars than long-distance truck drivers. So that would be a completely different situation from yours, really.
What I found is that if Milwaukee was an hour and a half from Madison, that I didn't need to live in Madison. My first couple of terms I kept an apartment here, but when I was a senator I would just commute, and it would be a long day, but that was a lot of driving. Now this is even before cell phones, so I've got to tell you that the hour and a half drive each way was really boring. You couldn't get any work done. Sometimes I dictate things because I had one of those old cassette tape recorders, but now you're right, John, that people are doing more driving. They can live farther away. You could live in Stevens Point, and you could commute to Madison and go back home every day because now there's Interstate 39.
Well, that would be a long day, though.
That would be a long day, but there are some people who are willing to put in 2 hours a day of commuting so they don't have to live in Madison. So you're right, legislators spend a lot of time behind cars, and I remember once being pulled over by a state trooper. It was late at night, I was driving back to Milwaukee, and I was speeding. And I got caught, I was nailed, state trooper pulls me over. So, you know, I hand him my driver's license, and he looks at me, he's really silent, and then he says, "I know who you are," you know. And I had just voted against increasing the number of state troopers. So, you know, when he said, "I know who you are," I thought it meant, "I'm going to punish you for that." But instead he paused, you know, that sort of grim, sort of Joe Friday kind of law enforcement look. And then he paused, and he said, "Don't do it again." And he handed back, and he didn't give me a ticket. But I think you're right. We as legislators, as politicians, spend so much time behind the wheel that we have a higher than average chance of getting stopped and or drunk driving.
Now, a speeding ticket probably wouldn't hurt you. I mean, everybody speeds.
Right.
Nobody's going to use that politically. Drunk driving, that's something
Absolutely.
else. This brings up, that's one of the stark differences between rural and urban within the legislature, and I'm thinking of an issue like, for instance, gun control.
Yes.
How do you write a gun control law that satisfies both Dodgeville and Milwaukee? Guns mean something entirely different in a small town, Wisconsin, than they do in Milwaukee. And so how do you reconcile?
And I tried, in my own naive way, to get some gun restriction laws passed. I was hoping to get the support of the gun lobby because they were such moderate. But it turns out that really extremists control the gun lobby. Nobody wants to be, in their side of the aisle, wants to be viewed as soft on guns. And so I never was able to get anything passed. And there really are two Wisconsins. I liked how you described it, John. There's the Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and there's the Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And what's happened is that if anybody wants to have a statewide career, if anybody wants to run for governor or attorney general or U.S. senator, they cannot be for gun control. And that's the reality of Wisconsin politics. And so Here we have a Democratic governor, we have 2 Democratic senators, and none of them are for gun control, because that's the reality of Wisconsin politics.
And national, President Obama has decided not to spend any capital on renewing the ban on assault rifles.
Absolutely. You know, there's a saying in politics that people who lose remember longer than people who win. And so, you know, let's say that you could pass a gun control law. The gun lobby, they would be so angry and they'd so remember it at the next election. But would the public at large that supported gun control, would they reward, would it be balanced? And that's an indication that it would not be balanced, because the public at large forgets. They move on to other issues. Whereas the one issue people, they only care about one issue and they remember. And that's in a sense why special interest groups have so much disproportionate influence, both in the Wisconsin legislature, when I served and today, and generally speaking in American politics, because they intensely care about one issue, and the public at large only casually cares about a zillion issues.
So that's why the single issue groups have so much clout.
Absolutely. You know, I'd ring a doorbell and somebody would say, well, I own a video store and you voted to crack down on how we held deposits. Whereas if I rang the doorbell of somebody who was a patron of video stores, they wouldn't even know about the law.
No idea.
And so that's in a sense why, you know, earlier in our conversation we talked about politicians being timid, being afraid of their own shadow. They didn't want those single issue people to remember them badly. And they never wanted to be on the wrong side of that. That there was no payoff to be for the public interest. And in a sense, that's where I fell out of the political consensus. I was always willing to vote for what I thought was the public interest, whether it was popular or unpopular politically.
And that brings us to the question we touched on earlier, campaign finance. And the amounts of money today, even in the assembly, we've now had $1 million assembly
Yes.
race. And so I guess the Democracy Campaign and others are saying that the legislators respond to their money constituency, not their voting constituency. Is that true?
You know, I'm afraid that the truth is yes. I'm afraid that campaign contributions are legal bribery. I mean, I can tell you that I knew situations where a legislator would calculate, if I vote for this, I'll get a $500 contribution from their PAC. And if I vote against it, not only will I not get that $500, but that $500 will go to my opponent, because this special interest group will remember. They'll punish me for it. And so that's one of the reasons why the current situation of campaign finances is such a mess, because legislators are afraid of special interest groups. They're afraid to antagonize special interest groups. And the other reason that it's such a mess is that rich people have money. You know, it's rich people who can write a $500 contribution or a $1,000 contribution. So you've got people who don't want to be populists. You know, they don't want to soak the rich. They don't want to increase taxes on the rich, because they know that they won't be able to get a contribution from that successful businessman or businesswoman for $1,000, even if that person sort of rarely would agree with them. And so you've got all the built-in incentives right now where campaign financing protects the entrenched interests and protects the rich. And the only way to get rid of it is the one way that Americans would hate, and that's by having complete public financing of elections. Now, what really surprises me is that the average Wisconsinite would say to you, I don't want my tax dollars to go to some politician I disagree with. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But that person is forgetting that right now, in the presidential campaigns, after a person wins the Republican nomination for president, or after a person wins the Democratic nomination for president, from that point on, their campaigns are publicly financed, unless they opt out. And Barack Obama, for example, had opted out. But normally, under most situations, presidential campaigns are publicly financed. And nobody makes a big issue about it anymore. We accept it. And I think that's one of the good things about presidential campaigns, that if they both accept public financing, they're on an equal level, they have the same amount of money to spend, and each of them has a fair shot to win. And I would love to see Wisconsin, maybe we should start with Supreme Court races. Maybe have public financing of Supreme Court races, which have really gotten out of hand since I left the legislature. They've really turned into partisan races of millions of dollars of spending. conservatives versus liberals, business versus labor. Maybe start out with public financing of Supreme Court races, and maybe the public would sort of accept it, would understand that a nonpartisan judge, maybe it's a good idea that they don't have to beg for dollars. They don't have to get on their knees to special interest groups.
As we speak, such a bill has gotten committee approval.
Right.
Just last week, I believe, or this week. You think it has a good chance?
No.
Even just for the Supreme Court?
I think what's going to happen is that everybody knows that this is a prelude to expanding it to governor's races and attorney general and state legislature. And so the interests who would be harmed by that expansion are going to try to kill this sort of camel's nose in the tent. They don't want to create the precedent. So I fear, even though I think it would be fabulous public policy, I fear it's not going to pass. And you know what? I hope I'm wrong. I hope somebody 10 years from now is going to watch this interview and say, look at how bad Mordecai was in predicting, and we've got it now, and it's wonderful, and I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, it seems a little bit pessimistic, but as somebody always points out, the people in office are the ones, the incumbents are the ones who got in under the present system. And why should they want to change the system under which they got elected?
Right. It's an incumbency protection situation that whenever they consider campaign finance issues, whenever they consider ethics issues, they're always saying, how does this affect me? And when we're voting on reapportionment, how does this affect me?
And those are issues that every legislator understands.
Absolutely.
Whether they're a policy wonk or not, those directly affect their own district, their own job, so they all know about those things.
And so that's why we have districts that are so one-party districts, predominantly Democratic, predominantly Republican, because the incumbents love it.
Their first interest is to get a safe district for themselves.
Right. Now, if I were to turn to my students and I were to start talking to them about reapportionment, within 5 seconds their eyes would glaze over. But John, you've really gotten to the heart of what's wrong with American politics, and that's that incumbents control the rules of the game. And so whether we're talking about how unfair campaign finance is, or whether we're talking about how unfair reapportionment is, or ethics codes, or drunk driving laws, this is all because the incumbents are saying, I want to protect my advantage. And that's the flaw of the American political system.
And also, it seems, is it just a perception, or has it become much more partisan and bitter since you were in?
I'm astounded at how partisan it's gotten. And again, to show you how ancient I am, when I was a chair of a committee in the state Senate, so now we're talking about the 1980s, most of the votes that the committee cast were unanimous. In other words, Democrats and Republicans voted unanimously for it. Not only did I kick out bills, let out of committee bills that were from Democratic authors, I let out bills that were from Republican authors. That would be unheard of nowadays. And I think that's sad. There's nothing wrong with being partisan over, some issues that are sort of above the waterline so that the public at large can see, well, there's a difference between a Democrat and a Republican. A Republican believes in these values and a Democrat believes in these values. But for the 99% of the daily work of a legislator, it's below the waterline. It's really the scut work of public administration, of making government work. And I don't understand why everything has to be so partisanized. And I think for some reason the word compromise over our lifetime, John, has turned into a dirty word. And in the 70s and 80s, in these ancient times of dinosaurs roaming the Capitol Square, compromise was a positive word. It meant that you met somebody halfway, that it was half a loaf, that half a loaf was better than none. Something changed in American political culture, and nowadays, here we are into the first decade of the 21st century, and the word compromise is a dirty word. And I don't understand what happened, and I think this is a bad development. I think that compromise is a good thing.
Why did it happen? What factors are different?
If I had to make a guess, I think it would be the rise of Newt Gingrich to be the Speaker of the U.S. Congress back in the 1990s. Newt Gingrich, in a sense, invented a form of politics that was rigid and ideological. And he was Republican, and he was willing to break with a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush. And he would embarrass the Republican leadership, but he was rigidly ideologically pure, and for some reason that caught on. And I think ever since then, politicians sort of learned their lesson that if they compromise, they'll be attacked by the ideological purists. And frankly, that's true about internal Republican politics. If you had a Republican, let's say, voting for a tax increase, they'd be absolutely killed. And that's also, I think, true about Democratic politics. If you had a Democrat who, let's say, was pro-life nowadays, that's the exception to the rule. They'd just be killed out there by the rest of the Democratic Party. So we've become less tolerant. The two parties have become more rigidly pure ideologically, and again, I think that's a negative trend.
Gingrich also spoke in harsh rhetoric. In fact, maybe he, to some degree, invented it. I mean, the right-wing Republicans would send out lessons how to talk like Newt.
Right.
And the lessons would be never say the word Democrat without prefacing it with high spending or something like that.
Right. And for example, I think that's great that you mentioned that, John, because not only has rigid ideology happened, but what you just said, it's the demonization of your opponent. You know, that your opponent, whether you're fighting them on the floor of the legislature or you're fighting them back home in a campaign for re-election, your opponent is not an honorable man or woman, is not a person who believes in public service. Your opponent is the devil. Your opponent is evil. Your opponent is out to rape the public. You know, your opponent is socialist and right. You know, exactly. There's demonization on both sides, and it's as though politicians think the only way they can be successful is to use that kind of hot rhetoric, because indeed they saw Newt Gingrich's rise from being a nobody congressman to being Speaker of the House when he used this demonizing language. And I wish we could get that out of the body politic, because I think it's just awful.
Given the amount of money that has to be raised and the demonization of the opponent and the fact that you might be personally attacked during a campaign, why do people still run for office? Can you recruit candidates?
You know, it becomes a self-perpetuating situation where if we've got a need for raising a ton of money, and you've got a need to be ideologically pure, then that means the candidates we get are candidates that can raise a lot of money and be ideologically pure, because the candidates who are more reasonable, who aren't obsessed, you know, who don't demonize their opponents, they lose elections. And so it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle. And I think the only way it's going to change is if there's a kind of a cataclysmic political event that makes this current culture collapse. I don't know what it is. For all I know, maybe it was Obama's election. Maybe Obama's election is going to change America. Maybe not.
The recession.
Or the recession, right. The recession, which has caused so many people to rethink their principles about what is good public policy. Until that happens, it's a kind of a Gresham's law, that the bad candidates drive out the good. And I mean that for both parties. I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats. And we need a situation where the more honorable, more moderate, more thoughtful people, both Democrats and Republicans, are winning primaries and winning elections instead of losing them.
This has all sounded pretty pessimistic. I want to finish up by asking your advice to someone, a young person who might want to get into politics today, somebody like you were. When you were first elected to the Assembly, wants to do good public policy and loves politics and so forth. What advice would you give to that person today?
You know, John, I'm thankful that we can end the conversation on a high note, because I do have students who sometimes come to me. They're working on a Master of Public Administration or Political Science, and they're exactly where I was when I was graduating from Madison in 1970, and I encourage them to run. Sooner or later, that generation will start winning elections, because I have to tell you that being a candidate for office is one of the most wonderful experiences in the world. To be exposed to all walks of life, to really be down in the grassroots and to talk to people and to see the goodness of America. I'm sounding like a commercial. I'm sounding like a Reagan commercial, but I encourage everybody to run, and some of them will win elections, because having an opportunity to fight for the public interest, having an opportunity to do good, having an opportunity to try to make a difference, to try to make the world a better place, is such an honorable activity and is such a transformative activity that I'm thankful to the voters that they gave me that opportunity. And I know that there's a new generation out there that understands the same things and that wants to get involved in public service and want to do good. And I would always encourage people, notwithstanding all the negatives we talked about in our conversation, that politics is a wonderful profession, and that I hope they'll run, and I hope they'll do good and make a difference.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me.